Welcome back. We're getting ready to jump into defining demand, talking about the difference between quantity demanded and a shift in the demand schedule. Um, I get sometimes in class you're lecturing and all of a sudden you look out at the group of students and they've got this glazed over look. They think, what in the world is he talking about? We'll try to simplify this as much as possible, because at the end of the day, concepts of supply and demand are going to be significant in your understanding, not only of courses that you take as an undergraduate, especially if you're in the econ finance departments, but also to just become a very productive resource for the company you go to work for once you graduate. Or again, as I said earlier, if you want to be in entrepreneurship, it may mean the difference between being a success and being a failure as an entrepreneur. So want to talk about some of the things and when we talk about demand, we're talking about the buyer side of the equation. So now we're talking about buyer side. We're talking about you and me going into Starbucks and buying a cup of coffee, or McDonald's to get a Big Mac, or you're downtown, maybe you're at Martin's barbecue joint. You go in and you're standing there trying to decide which one of the many selections that they have on the menu. So we're talking about those of us that are going to be buyers. Typically, buyers are. You may hear the term purchasers, you may hear the term consumers, but we're talking about the buyer side of the house at this point. So there are several things that impact the demand. The number one for most individuals, it may not be for Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Biden, Trump. There are individuals in the world that may not care about price, but for the most of us, price is going to be the driver. We're also, think about buyers' preferences. What information do you have available? And we'll get into these in more detail as we go through, but just kind of give you a high level view. And you're also looking at prices of related or goods and services. If you're buying that cup of coffee, and you're indifferent between coffee and tea, if tea's cheaper, you might decide, hey, I'm going to buy a cup of tea today. If you go to the grocery store trying to determine what you're going to have as your protein for dinner tonight, you're looking and you may really like beef, but if pork is half the price, you may say, I think I'm going to bite the bullet and I'm going to have some pork for dinner tonight. Also looking at buyer's income. I can remember the days that when I was a graduate student, or even as an undergraduate student, it was, if you were in the fraternity for breakfast the next morning, it may have been cold pizza that was left out on the table all night. You left over whatever else was left over from the party the night before. So because so as a student, you're short on income. So you think about things like buyer's income. Somebody told me that the cafeteria at Fisk, it's I don't know, I can't remember what they said, $8, $9, for a meal, individual meal. And I'm thinking, if you're especially an undergraduate, $8 or $9 for a meal, and at least in my understanding, it's all you can eat. You might be able to go to the cafeteria once during the day, and for $8 or $9, get enough, protein, carbohydrates, whatever else you need in your diet. You might be able to have one meal a day, and if you can get it for $8 or $9, that's pretty cheap when it comes to determining what you're going to have to eat that day. And then you've got demographic factors. So individual's age, individual sex, it's just all different demographic, factors are going to drive the demand for certain goods and services. And then lastly, and maybe as important as the rest of them, you've got expectations of the future. Think of the guy that, you walk downtown Nashville, and I can't think of any of the car dealerships, but you go into a car dealership and you're talking to them about buying a new car, and they, you read on the internet, here it is, like the end of August, and you know that the new models are going to come out, like in September, October, November, and you think, well, if I can just wait 3 or 4 months, I might get last year's model at a really good price. So depending on what price expectations are for cars, same thing with TVs or the new iPhone that's coming out. It's what are your expectations? So when we're looking at demand, and we want to talk about demand and the difference between demand and quantity demanded. Quantity demanded, it's goods and services. It's the quantity that buyers are willing and able to purchase. Again, willing and able to purchase at various prices during a particular time. And as a good economist, they always throw that in there. Ceteris paribus, all other things equal, all other things unchanged. So what they're saying is all of these factors we just talked about, expectations, income, demographic factors, none of those have changed. The only thing that's changing is price. Price has been allowed to move when we're talking about quantity demanded. And when you're talking about quantity demanded, we're going to get into it in a few minutes, but you're looking at that downward sloping demand curve, and you're going to have prices over here on the vertical. You have quantities down here on the horizontal. And as you move down that demand curve, you're talking about how much you're willing and able to purchase at different prices along that demand curve. And the demand, so you start out, and it's probably a good exercise if you've never graphed anything before, but I'm making the assumption that everybody's graphed something. It's somewhere along the way. But you have a demand table or a demand schedule, and it's nothing more than a table that shows you prices and quantities. It may be, $10 that, quantities, 100, and at $9, the quantity may be 200, and at, $8, it may be 300. And it's just a table. Think about an Excel table, because I think that's probably where a lot of people do their grafting. But if you think about an Excel table, column A is quantities, column B is prices, and you can take that information, slap it into a graph, and off you go. But that's what your demand schedule looks like. And then you have a demand curve, and that's just nothing more than a graphic representation of what's in that demand schedule. Again, you have that set up in Excel, you grab that stuff out of that table, you slap it into a graph, and off you go. And the demand curve itself, for the most part, there are exceptions to every rule, but for the most part, it's downward sloping. There could be some demand curves, and we may get into it later in this class. Demand curves can be flat. Demand curves can be vertical in very rare occasions. And you've always got, again, those rare exceptions, but for the most part, that demand curve is downward sloping. And it's downward sloping because of 3 things. One is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Let's say that you've been busy today in class and you haven't had a chance. You grabbed a cup of coffee for breakfast this morning, and here it is 8 o'clock at night, and you haven't had anything else to eat all day. So you go downtown to McDonald's. Then you go in and you grab that first hamburger, and it's like, I don't know what a hamburger is at McDonald's. Let's say it's $5. So you go in and you grab your burger at McDonald's, and you just devour it because you are starving. And then you think, well, that was a pretty good $5 burger. And you see on the sign on the wall said, that they're running a special, and if you bought one burger, you get the next one for $4. And you think, well, I'm still a little hungry. And you go up and you grab that second burger and it's $4 and you devour it, except it takes you a little while longer to devour it because you're not hardly as hungry as you were. And you're not receiving the same satisfaction or the same benefit that you had with that first hamburger. And then you look over at, here's another special over there. And this one is, buy the fish sandwich, and they've got them on sale for $1. And you think, man, I love those fish sandwiches. And you get one for $1 and you make it about halfway through the fish sandwich and you throw the rest of it away because you can't eat it. And that's what we're talking about, the law of diminishing marginal utility. You also see it like with individuals that are working out in the gym. They work out hard, they're sweating, and they're just worn out. And the gym has a cooler of water there by the door as you go out, with, prices of water. You grab that first bottle, that is the best water you've ever had. And then you grab that second bottle that, if they sold them at maybe a lower price, and that was a good bottle, but man, it wasn't nearly as good as that first one, and on and on. So, the other thing that I have seen is if you go over to, again, the farmer's market and the food court and that farmer's market, I have seen some of those establishments. You go and you buy a fountain Coke, and it's, I don't know, $3. And there's a sign there that says, refills $1. And you go back in and you'll pay $3 for your Coke, and then you're still thirsty. You go and you buy another one for $1 and you drink it, and your thirst is pretty much quenched. But you said, well, I paid $3 for the first one. I can get another one for $1, and you get in again. It just doesn't satisfy you like the first one did, especially. And it's a little better than, and it's not even as good as the second one. So that's where we're talking about marginal utility. Marginal utility, marginal prices cause that demand curve to be downward sloping. The second thing is the substitution effect. And we'll get into later in the chapter talking about, complements and substitutes. But let's talk about, we'll go back to Starbucks example, coffee and tea. So you go in and coffee's $5 a cup, and tea is like $3 a cup. And you're going to say, well, I'm a little short I'm a college student, I'm a little short on money, I'm going to switch to tea. And so you start buying tea rather than buying coffee. And that's the substitution effect. You're buying tea at a lower price than you're going to buy the coffee. And so now you're talking about substitutable goods. And the third thing is income effect, and that's what happens when you have substitutable goods. By substituting tea, $3 a cup, for the coffee, $5 a cup, now you've got an extra $2 of disposable income, and now you've got $2 in your pocket that you can go spend on something else. Again, as a college student, $2 is worth a lot to you, maybe. And so for those three things, decreasing marginal utility, substitution effect, and income effect, all of those are the drivers that cause that demand curve to be downward sloping. Again, demand curve's downward sloping, all other things equal. And as you have a change in the quantity demanded, so you're talking about moving along that downward sloping demand curve, and as price goes down, the amount of quantity demanded goes up because you're running out along that horizontal x-axis. So it's quantity demanded is a movement along a demand curve that results from a change in price. And you're talking about quantities at changing prices along that demand curve. It's not a shift in the demand curve. It's a movement along the demand curve itself. The demand curve hasn't moved out or hadn't moved back in. Demand curve's the same. We're just moving along that demand curve, and you're talking about different quantities at different prices. And then the law of demand states, and again, if you remember, you go back to chapter 1, I think, we talked about hypothesis, we talked about theories, we talked about laws. And you test your hypothesis, you don't reject it, you end up failing to reject it, and you run it a bunch of times, and other people, get in and they run similar hypotheses, and nobody is rejecting these hypotheses. And all of a sudden it becomes a theory, and then it's tested hundreds of thousands of times. And if it's not rejected, then it becomes a law. And so that's what happens with the law of demand. It's been tested who knows how many times, but it has never been rejected. So it becomes a law of demand. And it says for virtually all goods and services, a higher price leads to a reduction in quantity demanded, and a lower price leads to an increase in quantity demanded. And if you just think about everyday scenarios that you go through when you're talking about, we talked about in chapter 1, making choices. Think about all the choices you make during the day, and think about how many of them are driven by price. The price of goods or services are driving your choices. Now, if you want to talk, that's a change in quantity demanded. So we're moving along the demand curve, different prices, different quantities. If you talk about a change in demand, remember that demand curve is downward sloping. If you talk about a change in the demand curve, something has happened. So ceteris paribus has been relaxed. It's no longer in play. And some of the impacts or factors of demand and why people demand or willing to demand it and willing to pay, it causes, they've been relaxed and some of them have changed. So the demand curve moves out if it's increased. It moves downward to the left if it decreases. So those are shifts in the demand curve themselves. Either an increase in demand, it shifts outward to the right. A decrease in demand shifts downward to the left. And those are what we call changes in demand. And when you talk about an increase in demand and it's shifting out in this direction, we are changing the quantities at every price. It's not just quantities are changing at multiple prices as you move down the demand curve. We push that demand curve outward for an increase, or you push it downward to the left for a decrease. It doesn't matter, because you are changing the quantities that are impacted by those shifts at every price. And kind of with those notions, as we've spent a few minutes talking about quantity demanded, and we've spent a few minutes talking about shifts in the demand curve, either out or in. And I think I'm going to stop right there, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the demand shifters. We'll get into a little more detail on those factors that we were holding constant when we first started talking about demand. And now we're going to expand our understanding of those and see and try to figure out what happens and as those change going forward. So we're going to take that ceteris paribus, we're going to relax it, and we're going to see what those demand shifters do. See you in a few minutes.